Actually, I'm going to continue a little bit with Jesus here also in terms of the table of fellowship, which is another aspect of his own expression of and living out interculturality as we use that term today. And then we'll move on to the early church, and then on to ourselves. And when we come to ourselves, we'll also be looking at what does it mean for us in terms of our own need for conversion. We'll be looking at that.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to look first of all at Jesus, the reign of God, the table of fellowship. Then we'll move on to the church, the journey of interculturality. We're going to walk a bit quickly, but very profoundly through Acts of the Apostles. And we'll also then look at Paul's own journey in interculturality. And then what does that mean in terms of today? And then our own call to conversion. That's sort of the outline for today. So Jesus Christ, the reign of God and table fellowship. So this statement is taken from Evangelii Nuntiandi by Pope Paul VI. Christ, first of all, proclaims the kingdom of God. This is so important that by comparison, everything else became the rest, which is given only in addition. Only the kingdom, therefore, or the reign, is absolute, and it makes everything else relative. This is very strong. This is, of course, within the three synoptic gospels. John's gospel does not pick up the reign of God, but certainly in the synoptic gospels, this is central in that regards. So Jesus came not to preach himself or establish a church, but to preach, serve, and witness to the reign of God. That's what Jesus came to do. It's what Jesus said, the parables, the reign of God is, the reign of God is. That's what Jesus preached. He didn't talk about the Trinity. He didn't talk about the church in particular. That's going to come later. But what he's talking about is that reign of God. What Jesus did as he encountered the healings and exorcisms, those with physical, spiritual, psychological possessions and things like that, that was the reign of God, the breaking in of the reign of God now. As we know, when Jesus first came to his own hometown and he read the scriptures, and then when he put the scriptures down, he told the people, the reign of God is breaking in already now at this time. Yeah. The third area that we look at is Jesus' behavior, gathered in with the marginalized peoples, sinners, and women. This is through table fellowship. And this is all of these are related, but this last one is the one that really fits into the interculturality. Again, this morning we talked about these three sort of icons, as Adriana calls them. But here, the table fellowship is something that we find throughout in this way. Huh? Okay. So, for the sake, the goodness in terms of culture is that, as we said this morning, it's that culture does need to sort of distinguish people from other people. They need to be able to identify themselves. And they do that in various ways. The Jewish peoples did this, preserved their identity, protected their own boundaries, identity boundaries, and that by the rules of table fellowship, determining what's pure and impure foods, pure and impure people. Leviticus has the description of those purity laws to honor God's holiness. So in themselves, they are good. That's the way cultures determine. Certain cultures say we don't eat pork, we don't do this, we don't do that. These are ways that a culture will identify itself and distinguish itself. Jesus goes beyond the boundaries and an overly strict understanding of these rules of table fellowship. That's what he's reacting to. So the rules in themselves are not bad, but it's the overly strict that then pushes people out of the society. And so we go this through Luke, and as you probably know, if you want to follow the theme of eating and food, you go through Luke and then into Acts. There's a book called Eating Your Way Through Luke. It's all the stories of eating and sharing food together and things like that. And it continues through Acts, which of course is by the same author. The three people, the tax collector, the Levi, the woman washing the feet of Jesus, whose picture is here, and in the home of Zacchaeus. These people were all non-participant insiders. Remember that thing we talked about this morning? Participant these are non-participant insiders. These are all Jewish peoples, but they are all considered outsiders for various reasons. Tax collectors, those considered sinners, and others in that way. So this quote comes from our former Superior General, Tony Pernia. The primary image Jesus used for the kingdom was table fellowship, the subject of many of his parables and the object of many meals he shared with outcasts and sinners. Through this image, Jesus announced that God was inviting everyone without exception to communion with God. So again, the very power of that time of the table fellowship. Who did Jesus eat with? Okay. We know that we could do much more in terms of table fellowship on the reign of God. This is just to make this bridge, and it's very important for us when we consider interculturality. Again, this is the biblical and I would say theological basis for what we're doing here. Who do we eat with? Table fellowship. Again, Jesus witnessing to that openness for others. Now we're going to move on to Acts of the Apostles, the same author as Luke. And Steve and I have developed these 7 stages through the Acts of the Apostles. We developed this through this book that we co-authored, Constants and Context, A Theology of Mission Today, that was published in 2004. And this is what we developed in chapter 1. And this is something that, again, looking at Acts of the Apostles from the perspective of mission, but also now looking at it from the perspective of interculturality. How does that extend to all peoples? In the book, we go through a long chapter. I'm not going to go to such length. We're just going to walk our way through these 7 stages, and I'll spend a little more time on the latter ones. Okay. So again, we're using the lens of interculturality or mission as we look in terms of Pentecost. So before Pentecost, we certainly know that the origins of the church are rooted in the ministry, person, and mission of Jesus. We talked about that already this morning. Of course, we can talk much more about Jesus and mission, more than what we've said today, then the reign, and then, of course, the table fellowship. In chapter 1, verse 8 of Acts, you will witness to me in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. So there's a geographical going out to all peoples. The Spirit is going to lead a community in mission and towards its own identity. Now, the thing is, when we look at Acts of the Apostles, we know the end. We know how it's going to end at the very end, and we know how it's going to continue after Acts of the Apostles. What I'm inviting you now is trying to imagine at this moment, Jesus has died. The women and men disciples of Jesus are scared that's going to happen to them. They're hiding in the upper room. They don't know what's going to come. Okay? So I'm inviting you to go back to that moment. Don't jump forward too quickly. So they're at this point there. They're expecting the imminent inauguration of God's reign through the coming of Jesus. Jesus is going to come back. That's what they are expecting. That's the eschatology that they're expecting. And they're not at all thinking about a Gentile mission at this point. They're just trying to stay well and protected at this time. They're not thinking of going out to the Gentiles yet. We skip forward to stage 2, Pentecost. When the day of Pentecost comes, it is eschatological. It's the breaking in of God's into history, into time, but it's not what they expected. It's not the second coming of Jesus, but it's the coming of the Spirit. It's not the end time, but Israel is given a second chance. So there is something new breaking in, but it's not what they expected. And in Jerusalem at this time of the festival, there are many different nationalities, but they're all Jewish. These are not Gentiles yet. The Jewish peoples were living around the Roman Empire, which was around north of the Mediterranean, east of the Mediterranean, and south of the Mediterranean, North Africa. So they are different nationalities and different languages. There were Jewish peoples in the Arabian Peninsula at this time. There were Jewish peoples in the Persian Empire at this time. There were Jewish populations in India, in the present state of Kerala. There was Jewish populations before the time of Christ, because the Jewish peoples were in these various diaspora communities in India, because that was one of the navigational trade routes. So there were Jewish communities spread out around the whole known world at that time, even in Ethiopia, which was outside of the Roman Empire at this time. In other words, yes, there were different nationalities in Jerusalem, but they're all Jews, either by birth or some of them proselytes. Huh? Okay. They continued to visit in the temple as good Jewish peoples, and they stayed in Jerusalem. Now we're talking about immediately after Pentecost. It looked like the final days, as we know from Scripture. They said, don't worry about getting married now. Just stay single if you're single. If you're married, be good. So in other words, we're still preparing. There's more to come. The evangelization of Gentiles is still very far from their thoughts. They're not thinking about this at this point. Not yet. So this is more continuity with their wonderful Jewish culture and history. They see themselves as being within that Jewish tradition. Jesus is that Jewish Messiah that they've been expecting. They're not making that break at this point yet, but that's going to come. We go to stage 3. And what we find fairly early on in this early history of our Christian community is that we see the first notes of discord. Because amongst those Jewish Christians, there are 2 different groups of Jewish Christians. There are those that are called the Hellenists. These are the Greek-speaking disciples. They live in the diaspora. They live around the Roman Empire in many different parts of the world at this time. Then there are the Hebrews. This is the term used in Acts. Those are the ones who are the Hebrew-speaking Jewish Christians. Huh? And then there is the squabble or the problem of the equal distribution of food to the widows. And the Hellenist Jewish Christians are not getting their fair share. So already in this early part of the Christian community, there is linguistic differences. Those who live in the diaspora, Greek was the official language of the Roman Empire at this time. Latin's going to come later in the 3rd century in the western part. So still Greek is the formal language in the Roman Empire, the trade language. They had their local languages, of course. Culturally, they were in a different situation, social diversity. So they had their own communities. Most of the Jewish that lived around the Roman Empire lived in urban areas because that's where the trade was. Those of you that are familiar with Rome, the area is Trastevere. Trastevere was the area where the Jewish community lived at that time. They had their own communities, self-chosen communities that they lived in. So they had a very different perspective on the world at this time. They also had a theological diversity. It's going to be the Hellenist Jewish Christians that are going to be the first to more clearly identify the significance of Jesus as that Messiah and the significance of Jesus over Moses. They certainly honor and respect Moses, but recognizing that Jesus is the one we're waiting on. Huh? And so there are these 7 men, all 7 of them are Hellenist Jewish Christians, and they are appointed for the equal distribution to attend to the table. At this time, they were called diakoni, but they weren't deacons in the sense of strictly just liturgical, not so much liturgical at this point, but how do they attend to the table? And of course, nowadays our understanding of the deacons is also extending beyond the liturgy as well, at least in many places. Stephen is one of those who is appointed, one of those 7. He gives a speech. He talks about how the Jewish peoples have been called by God, how they're not faithful. And everybody said, yeah, we know that part of the history. But then when he started talking about the significance of Jesus, that's when he was stoned to death. That was considered blasphemy at that time. We move to stage 4. Philip was another of the 7. So after Stephen was killed, those were the Hellenist Jewish Christians. They began to get out of town, get out of Jerusalem, and go home to get out of that time. So there's persecution, but they continued preaching, sharing the good news that they had. Philip, first of all, is going to go to the Samaritans. Again, they were considered half-Jews. We already know that Jesus did this already. We know this already from what we talked about this morning, the Samaritan woman at the well and the Good Samaritan parable. But it's going to go further than that. Philip is going to encounter the Ethiopian eunuch. Whether he is what we call a God-fearer, in other words, somebody who knows about the Yahweh and knows about He is reading Isaiah. So, and we know that the Hebrew scriptures were in Greek, the Septuagint, so it was available to the people at this time. He was reading that. We're not quite sure if the Ethiopian eunuch was a Gentile who was interested in Judaism, or perhaps he was a proselyte to Judaism. There were also some Jewish peoples living in that part of the world of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was outside the Roman Empire. Egypt was inside. Ethiopia further south was outside. Any case, Ethiopia was the ends of the earth in those days if you went south. They didn't know about the peoples living south of the Sahara at this point. Ethiopia was to the ends of the earth going south. And so what happens there, as we know, Philip comes, he's the Ethiopian eunuch is reading the scriptures, the Isaiah, and he says, do you understand? How can I understand unless someone helps me to understand? Eventually, then he talks about accepting Jesus, baptism, there's water, he's baptized. Now we're going to the ends of the earth. And he's going to continue on, as far as we know, to Ethiopia. We're not aware of historical Christian community beginning in Ethiopia already now. That's going to come very early in the 5th century through Frumentius, and we're going to have a very ancient Christian community starting. Eventually, we know about that. However, what's happening is the circle is widening. Here we have the Ethiopian eunuch now being baptized and returning home outside the ends of the earth. The fifth stage, I'm going to spend more time on this. Now we have Cornelius and Peter. Cornelius, we know, is a Gentile. Again, with the Ethiopian eunuch, we're not quite sure. Steve and I have done a lot of reading with the scholars on this, and we're not quite sure exactly. But certainly with Cornelius, we have a Gentile. We know that from the scripture. We know he's seen as a good man, a pious person. Through prayer and a vision, he is called to send out for Peter, who's in a near time near Joppa. So this is happening to Cornelius and his household. In those days, people lived in sort of collectivist situations, communitarian. It wasn't just mom and dad and the kids. Households were bigger than that. Now, Peter is also called to another conversion. I'm using the word conversion here. You might want to use the word transformation, but a call away from his ethnocentrism. So here's an image here that I have of this carving here of Peter in his own dream. He's being told to eat of these various foods. And he says in Acts 10:14, "Sir, it's unthinkable. I've never eaten anything unclean or impure in my life." He's been a good Jewish person. He's followed the table of fellowship in that way. Been a good Jewish person in that way. The following verse, though, he realizes, here's the message: what God has purified, you're not to call unclean. So to go beyond a strict interpretation of a culture, or I would say a misinterpretation, and I've talked to our Jewish colleague here at CTU, Malka, she's on our faculty, about this question, because I certainly don't want to come across as anti-Semitic. No, we honor the culture. What Jesus was reacting to was an overly strict interpretation of religious practices. And we see this in other times too, when it talks about eating the grain in the fields and things like that. God purified, you're unclean. Peter and the messengers from Cornelius' household come to him. He receives them in his house. We don't know if he fed them or not, because feeding them in his house would have been already stretching the cultural understanding of table fellowship. But Peter then is going to go and follow them to the home of Cornelius. Later on, we hear in Acts 10:28, Peter realized that it's not proper for a Jew to associate with a Gentile, but he also knew that God has made it clear that no one should call anyone unclean or impure. This is where we're to be countercultural, God doesn't divide the us and thems, as we were talking about this morning. Peter said later in chapter 10, God doesn't have favorites. With anyone of any nationality who fears God and does what is right is acceptable to God. He said later, could anyone refuse the water of baptism to these people? Peter stayed in the household of Cornelius, and he apparently ate with them, because we're going to hear about this later in Acts. I consider this the second movement of conversion. I'm going to talk about this at the end of the talk today. I'm thinking about three movements of conversion. The first movement of conversion is against egoism, where we make Christ our center. The second movement of conversion is against any type of ethnocentrism or prejudice or racism, where we develop us and them categories that we put that into God, and not seeing all people as God's people. And there's a third one, which I'll talk about later. So even to the Gentiles, this is a very significant moment. As we know, Peter is just not, the role that Peter has for our church. When Peter goes to Jerusalem, he gets pulled on the carpet. People said, so you've been visiting the uncircumcised and eating with them, have you? They're not concerned about him baptizing Cornelius and household, but you've been eating with them. Again, the question of the cultural religious perspective, the food aspect. Who do you eat with? Peter's saying, who was I to stand in God's way? The image I have down there on the left-hand corner, I don't know if you can read it very well, God in unexpected places. Something new was happening here. I don't know if we can imagine how challenging this was to see how the God, Yahweh, when they heard this, they stopped objecting and instead began to glorify God in these words. If this be so, then God has granted life-giving repentance even to the Gentiles. We move to stage 6 of Antioch. This goes beyond the Cornelius story. Andrew Walls, Steve mentioned him yesterday, a Scottish missiologist that has done a lot of work with that in Africa. In his own work, he considers what happens there in Antioch the most critical events in Christian history. He calls it the climax of Luke, from what started in Luke's gospel all the way through Acts, what happens in Antioch. The Hellenists begin by preaching to the Jews, but then they go to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles believed and were converted to the Lord. This goes beyond the Cornelius story of a single household. Now Antioch. Antioch is a major city in the Roman Empire, so third largest city. Largest city was Rome. Second was Alexandria. The third largest was Antioch. Antioch was a very key city. This is a radical move beyond ethnocentrism. The use of the term Kyrios Christos, Christ Lord. Lord is Christos, of course, the Messiah, the Lord, the Anointed One, Kyrios as Lord. By using this term, not just talking to the Jewish peoples in terms of the Messiah, but also Kyrios, the Lord. Something that Gentiles could also identify with from their own background. And Steve and I talk about this as being the breakthrough from a Jewish sect, and I'm using sect in a good sense, a party, a group within a religion. I don't mean it in a negative sense. Moving from being a part of Judaism, which we saw before Pentecost, to now something new. It was at Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. So the outsiders are saying, this is something new. Steve and I call this the real birthday of the church. Now, I know our church liturgies talk about Pentecost as the birthday, and we're not asking you to rewrite the church prayers. But what we're talking about here is that at Pentecost, they still did not see themselves as distinctive from their Jewish history and what was something new, the new religion that was coming to be in Antioch. It moves to stage 7. We have the Council of Jerusalem around the year 49. So what's been happening now? We've been seeing that, Peter is going, what happened with Cornelius' household. We have Paul and Barnabas in Antioch. We have other people too spreading out to the Gentiles. And so now they have this first council in Jerusalem. When I teach my history course, I call this the First Ecumenical Council. And here is what happened. They're dealing now as a council. Now as a church, how do we deal with what's going on? The issues of circumcision and dietary laws. And then they hear the testimony from Paul, from Peter, from Barnabas, and from the others. And in the end, James, at this time, who is the head of that community in Jerusalem, of that early Christian community, God is taking from among the Gentiles a people to bear God's name. We ought not to cause God's Gentile converts any difficulties. This, of course, is a major decision that happens here. Well, what happened to Peter in Cornelius, that's an individual, stretching beyond that. Christianity is beyond a single culture. It includes the Jewish peoples, but it's beyond that. But what happens here in the Council of Jerusalem is that it becomes a communal call beyond ethnocentrism. And I think this is what's very important for us. We can talk about our own individual need to overcome racism, prejudice, our own individual, what we have to continually work at. But we also have, as a community, we have to overcome our own prejudice as a community. In the SVD world, I think we can talk about this in terms of local communities, provinces, regions, missions, zones. I've heard stories by some of our SVDs saying, we're a little suspicious when people come from a certain part of the world, they come here. These prejudices are also communal, individual and communal. The mission to the Gentiles through the second half of Acts of the Apostles continues. Paul preaches to the Jews. He doesn't give up. The Jews often, normally, not all, but most, reject their message. The Gentiles accept. So if you think of, as a kid, you see this pond of calm water. You take a pebble, you throw it into the pond, and you get the ripples. That's what's happening here in Acts of the Apostles. The pebble, that word of Jesus, part of God's mission, the reign of God. And now what we see in Acts of the Apostles through these stages, the ripples are going out. People are moving beyond their own context, their own situations. Is moving out in that way. And that's a process that we're still about today. That rippling is still to continue as we move on. SVD is starting the African American Seminary 20 years ago, 100 years ago. That's that rippling going out. We can talk about Paul also in terms of interculturality, and these are some other instances of Paul engaging Gentiles, whether it's a Gentile woman or Silas, and the various people. So this same process, again, you can follow these meal all the way from Luke all the way through Acts as you follow along, because the eating with is very important, as we know. I'm going to focus a little more here on Paul and the Areopagus. So what happens here is Luke's Paul, and I say Luke's Paul in the sense that it may not be identical with how Paul comes across in other parts of the New Testament. Here he goes to Athens, to the center where you have many of the philosophers gathered together. He comes into their place of where they have their debates or their discussions, and he notices there is an altar to a God unknown. So he identifies that there is some searching for a God unknown, and he says, let me tell you who that God unknown is. Verse 17, chapter 17, verse 27, Creator God, who does not need a shrine, has ordered human life with a purpose, quote, so that all humans would search for God and perhaps grope for God and find God. He's making a connection with the searching of the philosophers. And he contextualizes his speech. In other words, he connects it with their altar. There, the unknown God, let me tell you about that. Then he uses some of their poetry from their own wisdom literature that he had at this time. And then he talks about God calling everyone to conversion. After he does his preaching, that's his responsibility. Some people sneered at him, but a few were baptized. Our responsibility is to proclaim the word of God faithfully. How people respond, as we know, that's dependent on how they respond to God's grace in their life. So the Areopagus and the interculturality. This event in the Areopagus represents Luke's, Paul, and probably Luke's community, because that's who he's writing to and for, engaging the secular philosophy and culture of the Greco-Roman world. This morning, John Kirby asked about secularity. That's what Luke is doing here. He's engaging the secular philosophical world. So him doing that in the Greco-Roman world, that is crossing another cultural and religious boundary as part of the mission of the reign of God. But what we're talking about here is not the ethnicity, but we're crossing into that world of the other, the culture but also the world of the other, the philosophers. Thus, Luke has Paul doing at the Areopagus what Jesus and the Christian community's boundary-breaking table fellowship signifies and implies. That mission is about moving beyond one's culture, comfort zones, in order to witness to God's vision of universal inclusion. Moving beyond our context in that broader sense that we talk about, generations and all of that. St. Pope John Paul II, he talks about the Areopagus also in Redemptoris Missio, 1990, in that document. He draws a parallel between Paul's encounter with the Areopagus and the new sectors in which the gospel must be proclaimed today. When he talks about that, he talks about global migration, the digital age today we talk about. That was the question that Sonny was asking about this morning. How do we engage the new Areopagi of our world today? Again, reaching outside our comfort zones. What is the Areopagus of our religious life and within our ministry and mission today? When we talk about the Areopagus and prophetic dialogue, and we'll talk more about the prophetic dialogue tomorrow. We'll talk about that tomorrow afternoon. But we're familiar with that as SVD. So when Paul engaged the philosophers, the secular society, it was dialogical because he started out by saying, here, the God unknown, let me start. This is what you're searching for. Let me start with your questions. Let me start with your questions. He used 2 Greek poems. He used some of their wisdom literature. And he trying to make it dialogical so that the Greeks could understand what he's talking about. But he's also very prophetic. Paul is not scared to say the message. Faithful to proclaiming the gospel. He talked about Jesus Christ, the resurrection, and the call to conversion. So Paul both acknowledged spiritual searching, dialogical, and he presented the gospel in their worldview so they could understand. And that's what we're doing today. This morning, some of you are asking, how do I preach about this? That's what we do. We try to know where people are coming from. What's their perspective? How do we connect? There was a bumper sticker back in the 70s. Maybe I'm the only one left that remembers it. There's a bumper sticker in the U.S. that said, Jesus is the answer, but what is the question? So what is the question that people are asking? What's millennials? What is that? Jim Leaner talked about the young people yesterday. Well, what's the question that people are asking? When I talk to my nieces and nephews, what is the question that they're asking? My nieces are very diverse. They're from one end of the screen to the other in terms of their Christian faith. One end to the other. So that's what this is about. That's what Paul was doing in the Areopagus. What's the question that those Greek philosophers are asking? What was Cornelius looking for? What was the Ethiopian eunuch? What was he searching for? What's the ongoing call to conversion underlying interculturality? The first movement is moving from egoism to Jesus, you are the center of my life. As we know, this is a lifelong process. In our novitiate, this is very much at the center. Our Ignatian retreat, for those that did that. We move. This is that, how do we put Jesus as the center of life? That second movement of this conversion, no one should call anyone unclean or impure. No one. God does not have favorites, neither should we. That's a second movement from ethnocentrism, racism, prejudice. In any ways, us, them categories we use beyond ethnicity, to interculturality. That's a term we use today. A better word might come up later, but you know what we're mean by it. These are both lifelong conversion processes. Peter went through both of these. We know Peter, when first of all, he said yes to following Jesus, but then later, and he calls it Jesus Christ, you're the Lord, you're the one that we're waiting on, his profession of faith. At the time of Jesus' passion, he denies Jesus. Later on, after the resurrection, of course, he again expresses his love and his faith in Jesus. That's the first movement of conversion. We also talked today about the second movement of conversion for Peter when he was on the housetop in prayer and saying, people are impure. He said, no, look beyond that. Go to the Gentiles. They're the ones that you need to go to. Move outside of your patterns and even to share food with them. Of course, later, it's not just Peter as an individual. The Council of Jerusalem is saying that. This happens again in Vatican II. You don't have to be Western to be Christian. You can keep your culture, the good aspects of your culture, your language, enculturation. So this is that heart and motivation for the spirituality of intercultural life and mission. And now I'm going to add a third. So first, egoism to being Christ-centered, ethnocentrism, interculturality. The third is from consumerism to care of creation. This is in 2015. Pope Francis spoke about we need to have an ecological conversion. Moving away from where consumerism, where things are more important than people, to a real care of creation. And all three of these, it's spiral. They're not linear. It's not like I do one tomorrow, Mondays I do one, Tuesdays I do two, and then I do three. No, they're all connected. And how are they all connected? They're all connected because as we come from God, we come down and we go back to God. In that process of returning to God, we are to be transformed more into what God is, the image that we are created in. We talked about this yesterday in our first session. And in that process, change our lives individually, our egoism, transform that, kenosis, our ethnocentrism, how we divide people into us and them. That's not what God is calling us. That's not the reign of God. And then also, when God created all creation. So how are we related to this creation? How do we respect our creation? We don't make our desire for, goods and that, and our misuse of the environment. This is the third area. This is an area where a lot of people are reflecting more on these days, not just in the West. I work a lot with indigenous peoples. They talk a lot about the care of creation. When I was in New Guinea, other places too. This is, and many other people are talking about this. This is a rather newer idea in terms of these three movements of conversion. You're getting something sort of fresh off the press right now. I've been using this and talking about it, and a lot of people are saying, okay, yeah, how do we make these connections? Now, this retreat is focused on number 2. If it was an Ignatian retreat, we'd focus on number 1. But number 2, we're talking about this ethnocentrism. So this is, but it's a part of the whole. It's a part of the whole, I think.